Alright, class, today we're going to continue our lesson on punctuation. Today we're going to be talking about ellipses, underlining, and quotation marks, and how we can use these to enhance our writing. To begin, we're going to start with ellipses. Ellipses are the three little dots that you often see in writing. There's an example of it right here on your screen. What these three dots mean is it's indicating the intentional omission of a word, a sentence, or a section of the text, and it does not change the meaning of the sentence. So if you look on the screen right here, there's an example of that. I'll read that to you. It says, Hamlet asked whether it was nobler, ... to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles. Now, in this example, those three dots are omitting the word in the mind. So let's go ahead and reread that quote, but put in the mind in there, and we'll see if it changes the meaning or not to have that removed. Nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against the sea of troubles. If you take a look at that sentence, if you take out the words in the mind, the sentence still makes sense. You're not changing the overall meaning of the sentence, and what it does is it's going to shorten down that quote to make it more relevant. In the mind isn't really necessary for you to understand what's going on in this quote. So that's the main use for ellipses. Now we're going to take a look at how we can use ellipses in informal writing. So this first example, you can use an ellipses to represent a trailing off of a thought. So for this example, it says, if only I hadn't, oh, it doesn't matter now. With this, it's kind of showing your readers that there was this thought present, but now it's not there, and it's omitted because it doesn't need to be exposed. It's going to add the emphasis to the reading. You can also use it to indicate your hesitation with your speaker. For example, I wasn't really, well, what I mean is, see, what I'm trying to say is, I didn't mean to kick your puppy. Using these ellipses in this example of a narration is to show there's hesitation with your speaker. You can tell that the speaker is gathering their words, and it kind of adds more voice to your writing, which is going to make it more interesting to read. If you use ellipses too much, it can just be over-exaggerated, and it's distracting to your readers. So make sure you really want to use that, and it's going to enhance the meaning of your writing before you put that in your writing. Let's move on to using ellipses in formal writing. When you're using a quote in your essay, and you're taking a section of the quote that doesn't start at the beginning of the sentence, you don't have to put any ellipses at the beginning of that quote to show that there was something before it. You can just go right into the quote. For this example right here, he called them loud, smelling, utterly annoying as he closed the door. With this example, it's likely that the he that they're talking about in this sentence had been meeting with the people and talking to them before he called them loud, smelling, utterly annoying. It would be kind of random and silly, as if some guy in the room was just being silent and all of a sudden called everybody loud, smelling, utterly annoying, and walked out without saying anything else. So in this example, we can see that the most important part of the quote is the loud, smelling, utterly annoying. We don't need to know what came before or after that to understand the use of this quote in this context. When we're using a quote in our sentences, and it's the end of a sentence, but the quote continues on. In other words, the quote you're going to share in your essay, if you're only using part of the quote and the sentence continues on before you're done using it, you're going to just use the ellipses afterwards. So an example of this is, Thoreau argues that by simplifying one's life, quote, the laws of the universe will appear less complex, ... and then the citation page. Putting this ... before the quotation mark at the end signifies that Thoreau went on to explain more, but what he had to say is not relevant to what we're going to say in our paper, so we just omit it by using those ellipses. And then if you notice after the citation, we put a period because we're ending our sentence in that example, in that essay. Now let's move on to underlining. Underlining is used to show emphasis, to identify books, films, and names of famous vehicles. and also to emphasize certain words or other. In this example, I have a time is emphasized. So this using underlining was mainly used in typewriting and in handwriting because you didn't have a way to do bold letters or italicized letters when you're using a typewriter or using your handwriting. So when you're drafting things by hand, this is when you'd want to underline things to show that you're going to emphasize this, and then when you're going to type it up later, you can change that to be bolded or italicized. But let's take a look at a few of these examples. The first one is emphasizing time and directions or instructions. So I'll read it to you. It says, the meeting will start at 9:30 a.m. exactly. Do not arrive late. In this sentence, 9:30 a.m. and not are emphasized to show importance of the time of this meeting and how it's important to not be late. The other examples would be for, like I said, to identify titles of books, films, and the name of famous vehicles. So we have the famous Space Shuttle Challenger. That would be underlined in handwriting, but it'd be italicized in being typed. Same thing with the Titanic, the Orient Express, and the book 1984. With the book 1984, it would actually be italicized, not in quotation marks, to have that emphasized because it's a longer work. We're going to talk about that on the next page. So that brings us to our quotation marks. This is how you'd use quotation marks not in a dialogue. So with titles of short works like poems, articles, short stories, or chapters of like chapter headings, chapter titles in a book, you would put those in quotation marks when referencing those in your writing. An example would be the first poem in this book is called The Road Not Taken. The Road Not Taken is the title of the poem, and it's in quotation marks to have that be distinguished from the rest of the sentence. Another example would be chapter 7 is entitled The Sorting Hat. That's the name of chapter 7 in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. We're putting the sorting hat in quotation marks to keep it separate from the rest of the sentence. An exception to this rule is if you have a larger body of works that's comprised of different parts or different books, you would keep the title of the longer work in italics, but then the different sections or different books in that work would be in quotation marks. For example, when mentioning The Lord of the Rings, you'd italicize Lord of the Rings, but then when you reference The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King, which are the 3 books that make up The Lord of the Rings, you use those smaller books in quotation marks. And that's how you distinguish this in your writing.